All right, welcome everyone to our third and final webinar of the season, an in-depth look into using TreeAzin for spongy moth control. Thanks for taking the time to attend today. My name is Elsa and I lead the Forestry technical support team here at Lalamon Plant Care. So it seems that spongy moth shows up everywhere you look these days. It's consistently been in the news every spring and summer over the past few years. It's spread across southern and eastern Ontario and defoliated almost every tree in its path. And it has gone through a couple of name changes before settling on spongy moth. So it's gotten quite a bit of attention lately. I know a lot of you have gotten a bit creative in your ways to control spongy moth, whether using duct tape or burlap for tree banding, experimenting with pheromone traps to capture the male moths, um, to even trying your hand at BTK spraying. And the truth is, those are all very good, viable options for control, and using all those tools are part of a good IPM program. A lot of you are very familiar with TreeAzin and its efficacy against the emerald ash borer, but some of you may be less familiar with its use for spongy moth. So let's take a deeper look and see how you can incorporate it in your treatment plans. So if we were to spend a few slides to go over TreeAzin, we would quickly review that TreeAzin is a systemic insecticide with an Azeroactin formulation. It isn't a contact or topical insecticide. It really has to be ingested for it to be effective. And its active ingredient is Azeroactin, and it's derived from a botanical source. It was developed by the CFS, so the Canadian Forest Service, in collaboration with Bioforest, and they still hold the intellectual property of the product, but we have a worldwide license to manufacture and distribute. So TreeAzin can be used on deciduous and coniferous species against a variety of insect pests, especially when it comes to pests like spongy moth. You can use TreeAzin on conifers such as spruce and pine, just like you can use it on deciduous trees like oaks and maples. Now, injections on conifers can sometimes pose a bit of a challenge, especially when dealing with resinous sap. But as always with TreeAzin, you simply have to exercise a little bit of patience to be successful. For those of you who are less familiar with Azeroactin, it's an extract from the neem tree seed kernel, and it shouldn't be confused with neem oil. Neem oil is the crude component that you get when you press neem plant materials together. So the leaves, the twigs, the fruits, whereas Azeroactin is really what is extracted from the seed kernel itself once it's been processed. The neem tree grows primarily in Southeast Asia, as we can see here on the map, and these shaded areas are where plantations are popping up. And its popularity has steadily increased over the years. It's been around forever, but you might actually, see some neem products in natural health food stores. Many people believe that products made from neem trees can have antifungal, antibacterial, sedative, and even antiviral properties. But what makes it really important to, and interesting for us is that it's toxic to a wide range of insect pests, so molting organisms. And since us mammals, we don't molt, the risk of toxicity is extremely minimal. So if there's one slide I would like you to remember, it's probably this one. How does TreeAzin, or more specifically, how does Azeroactin affect the spongy moth? So as we know, the larval stage is the stage that defoliates and creates the most damage. So it's important to make sure that the product targets the larvae/caterpillar. Basically, the larvae must ingest the product in the foliage in order to be affected. And once that happens, the Azeroactin basically acts as a growth regulator. So if the larvae ingest some Azeroactin, they won't be able to molt into their next instar, effectively interrupting their growth. So if we were to go over the spongy moth life cycle together, we could start in the winter when the larvae are overwintering in those egg masses. These egg masses, as you know, can be found pretty much anywhere: oaks, maples, Colorado blue spruces, white pines, wooden park benches, garbage cans, and garages. They really don't discriminate. And so those eggs will then hatch in the spring, typically in mid-May, so in a few weeks from now, when where those young larvae/caterpillars will start to feed on the foliage. And this feeding will go on until early to midsummer, when they will, they'll reach about an inch in length, and their heads will turn yellow, and they'll stop feeding and start to pupate. Once they've pupated, the moths will emerge, and typically takes a few weeks for them to emerge, and then they'll begin mating. The females don't fly, they stay where they pupated, and they'll release a pheromone to attract the males. They'll mate, and the females will then lay her eggs, and the whole process will begin anew. So a lot of people ask us, when should we start treating? When should we start using TreeAzin for spongy moth? When can I get the most bang for my buck? So it's our recommendation to start your injections to coincide with about 10% egg hatch. Now, if you're not out in the field each day studying egg masses the way some of us are here at LPC, it might be a bit challenging knowing exactly when that might be. So, like I mentioned in a previous slide, this typically happens in mid-May, but it can definitely vary by year and by region. So, we produce maps for all regions with a spongy moth presence using a special computer program called Biosim. And so Biosim was developed by Natural Resources Canada, and it basically uses a degree day accumulation model to forecast spongy moth emergent states. So these maps are updated weekly, usually starting in late March up until the end of June or so, and they can be found on our website. If you are having to look over at our website, you might also notice that there are some maps for 90% egg hatch on there. These maps are mostly used to guide treatment timing for BTK spray programs. So when you have a look at these maps, make sure that you're having a look at the 10% egg hatch rate and not the 90. So there's been a lot of talk lately on bees and bee health in particular. So, of course, we're very interested in TreeAzin's toxicity to bees. On our label, it does state that TreeAzin is toxic to bee brood. So in order for Azeroactin to be toxic to bees, it would have to reach the beehive and find itself in the young bee larvae. So here we're comparing TreeAzin, or Azeroactin rather, to other commonly used active ingredients in plant healthcare. As we know, when we're measuring toxicity, we use the amount of a toxic agent that is sufficient to kill 50% of a controlled population, usually within a certain time, the LD50, which is also called the median lethal dose. Now, the larger the amount, in this case measured in micrograms per bee, the less toxic it is to the target. So if we have a look here at our chart, we can see that it would take 6.1 micrograms of AZA to be fatal to 50% of a controlled bee population, whereas in contrast, it would take anywhere from 0.24 to 0.0179 micrograms of imidacloprid to be considered toxic to bees. Now, the other two, dinotefuran and emamectin benzoate, are other actives that are registered in the US. And so by EPA's scale for rating toxicity, so EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, Azeroactin is considered moderately toxic to bees. And in contrast, those other actives that are often used for plant healthcare treatments, uh, namely imidacloprid and dinotefuran and emamectin benzoate, are all highly toxic to bees. So this is why we always stress that tree injections be performed post bloom. So our label is very clear. All injections must be done post bloom. So when we're treating deciduous trees, we have to be mindful of when certain tree species flower, because according to certain researchers, including Dr. Reed Johnson from the Ohio Agriculture Research and Development Center, bees actually do forage on tree pollen for a certain amount of time in the spring. So it's crucial to really make sure to wait until the flowers have dropped in order to minimize the risk to our pollinators. Luckily, spongy moths' favored hosts, oaks and maples, usually bloom early enough in the spring to allow treatments in May. But if you're unsure of the flowering time of a certain species, take the time to do a bit of research before you set out to perform your injections. And the reason to do your research is because certain tree species, such as tilias, for example, like basswood and lindens, they actually flower pretty late in the season. So it's not unusual to see a linden in bloom in late June, early July, full of bees, aphids, wasps flying around. And in late June and early July, if we remember our spongy moth life cycle from a few slides ago, the larvae have either stopped feeding and started to pupate, or they've already started their pupating process. So for this reason, it's really important to never treat tilias for spongy moth. If you were to treat at the correct life cycle, the correct life stage of the insect, the trees would not have yet bloomed. And if you were to wait until they did bloom, it would be too late in the spongy moth life cycle. You'll also want to stop your injections once you notice that the caterpillars have reached about an inch in length. At that point, they've either stopped feeding or are already nearly done feeding and they're ready to pupate. You'll notice their yellowed heads, as we can see here in these pictures. And, always keep in mind that, when they're a larger size, they also have to consume more foliage. So they have to create more defoliation damage in order to ingest enough TreeAzin to be effective at interrupting their next molt, basically. So, of course, you might and will encounter people who will call you a little bit too late in the season looking for treatments against the spongy moth. And unfortunately, there isn't much we can do at this stage. So it's important to be clear that TreeAzin spongy moth treatments are only for the young larval stages. When we're starting to see, female moths laying their eggs, like in this third picture, it's way too late, and it's time to start booking your treatments for the following year. It's important to note that we still see some defoliation in treated trees. This is completely normal. Remember that TreeAzin's mode of action means that the larvae need to ingest some treated foliage for the product to have effect. So again, the later we treat in the season, the more foliage the larvae have to consume for it to be effective. So I think the important message here is it's really important to manage your customers' expectations. They do need to expect some defoliation. And of course, again, the later you treat, the more defoliation they'll have to expect. So here in this picture here on the right, we can see two oaks, one that was treated and one that wasn't. We can notice a small amount of defoliation on the tree on the right, whereas the tree on the left is completely defoliated. Turning over now to dosing rates. When we're treating for spongy moth, we want to make sure that we're using the correct dosing rate. Like all Lepidopteras on TreeAzin's label, we're looking at 3 milliliters per centimeter of diameter, which makes treatment a nice viable option, not only in terms of cost, but also environmental impact. So this means we're going to be using a different dosing table than we typically use for the emerald ash borer. We want to make sure that we use the 3 milliliter green dosing table, which is found at the back of the EcoJect system manual in the appendix. And it's critical that you follow the chart, of course, because it'll give you the exact amount you need in order to ensure that the tree receives 100% of the dose it needs. So, I say this very, very often, but I recommend that copies of this dosing chart are made, that the applicator carry a copy of this chart while in the field, because it'll tell you exactly how many canisters you need and how many of each size you may need for each tree. So in this example, a tree of 22 centimeters in diameter will require 6 8 mil canisters and 1 20 mil canister for a total of 7 injection sites. So don't forget to use the dosing rate tables while you're drawing up your quotes also, because then you'll be able to tell exactly how much product will be needed, and you'll be able to settle on a price pretty quickly. Another difference you might notice with this dosing chart is the ratio, is the ratio between 8 mils and 20 mils. It's the opposite of treating for EAB. So when we're using 3 mils per centimeter, you'll be using a lot more of the smaller 8 mil canisters. So make sure you have enough in your inventory before you start the season. So over the next few slides, we'll review TreeAzin's environmental impacts. I know some of you are very familiar with this, but I think it's always nice to review it together. So when we're looking at the environmental profile of TreeAzin, a question we can often ask ourselves is, when the leaves of a treated tree fall to the ground in autumn, what does that mean for the decomposer invertebrates? So the earthworms, the snails, the slugs, the bacteria, the mushrooms, that whole ecosystem. And so this is a research paper that was published by Dr. David Kreutzweiser on that very subject. He basically tested the residues of TreeAzin in senescent leaf material so that he could see if it would have an impact on those critters. So whatever product you're using, there's always a risk of ground contamination from senescent leaf material. But after his studies, Dr. Kreutzweiser came to the conclusion that the Azeroactin concentration in those leaves would likely pose very little risk of harm to decomposer invertebrates. Another question that comes up pretty often is, once we inject the product, what happens to it and how quickly does it start to work? This is especially, important information to share with your customers. They'll likely ask you, how soon can we expect to see some control once the injection has been done. So this was a research project that measured quantifiable amounts of TreeAzin in the foliage a few hours after injection. And the results were published in an article here by Susanna Grimalt, and basically state that complete translocation of the product within the crown happens within 48 hours after the injection process. On top of that, as we saw earlier, essentially all of the TreeAzin dissipates within that leaf material prior to leaf fall. So there are no quantifiable levels of TreeAzin that can be found in that next year's foliage. So basically, you can tell your customers that TreeAzin will be found in the foliage within 48 hours of the injection, and they can probably expect to see some control after a few days of feeding. And so, because TreeAzin dissipates, naturally within the foliage over the course of the season, and because the targeted life stage, is the defoliating larvae, spongy moth treatments should be done on an annual basis. Of course, you should monitor populations annually. If the pest pressure does not warrant treatment, of course, then there's no need to inject. Finally, just a few notes on treating oak trees. I know some of you might not be familiar with treating oaks. I would say on average, oaks have incredible uptake. It's night and day versus ash trees. Not only are we using smaller doses, but we're also injecting into diffuse porous trees. So, if you're used to treating ash trees that are ring porous, you know that they can be pretty temperamental and inconsistent with their uptake times. In ring porous trees, the majority of those conductive tissues are in that last year's growth, close to the cambium. But with diffuse porous trees, those conductive tissues are spread a bit more evenly along the injection hole, which allows for quicker uptake. So on top of that, you'll also be using, of course, those smaller canisters. So your uptake times should be pretty quick comparatively to ash treatments. Usually, if you have a canister that is having a hard time emptying, especially when you're injecting in oaks and maples, it's likely because the nozzle has been clogged. So then in that case, I would simply remove the canister, replace the nozzle with a new one, and then mate the canister back on, and that should solve your issue. Now, when we're treating for oaks, we recommend sealing injection sites on oaks with a pea-size amount of grafting wax. And the reason for that is because with the threat of oak wilts, looming here in Canada, we want to avoid, creating a potential wound that will attract natidolid beetles to the tree. So for that reason, I recommend sealing your injection sites on oaks with pea-size amounts of grafting wax. Now, we no longer sell grafting wax. We used to, but unfortunately, we can no longer source it. But Lee Valley sells something similar to what we used to offer. It comes in a tin, so it's less likely to make a mess than the stuff we used to have in inventory. So whatever you use, you can use, wet paper towel, or, some folks will get pretty creative, but make sure it's biodegradable and unscented. So remember that natidolid beetles, they're attracted to the sweet smell of the sap. So something like beeswax might seem like a good idea, but, the smell of it might actually be a little bit counterproductive. So always ensure that you're using something that is unscented. All right, so I feel like we covered a lot of ground in a short amount of time. These webinars are meant to be, just a few minutes long. So quickly, just to recap, here are a few important points to remember. So your dosing rate is 3 milliliters per centimeter of diameter, and your treatment should coincide with 10% egg hatch. This is typically in mid-May, and you can check our biosim maps on our website for our latest forecast. And treatments should end, once the caterpillars are about an inch in size or their heads have turned yellow. Otherwise, most of the damage has already occurred, and they will require to ingest more foliage for it to be effective. It's important to remember to not treat lindens or basswoods or any trees in the Tilia family for spongy moth. This is because they don't bloom until late June, early July or so. which is way past our treatment window for spongy moth. So remember, TreeAzin can only be applied post-bloom in order to reduce the risk to our pollinators. And because TreeAzin dissipates naturally within the foliage over the course of the season, and there are no quantifiable amounts of TreeAzin present in the next year's foliage, spongy moth treatments should be considered an annual treatment. So it's good to monitor every year for pest pressure. And finally, like we just saw when treating oaks, we recommend to seal the injection site with some grafting wax just to minimize the risk of a potential oak wilt infestation. And so, yeah, I think that now brings me to the end of the presentation. If you have any questions or comments, or you'd like to discuss anything covered here further, please feel free to contact our support team via email, so support@bioforest.ca. And if you'd like to place an order, simply give our order desk a call or send them an email. You guys are pretty familiar with that process, I'm sure. So yeah, so thanks everyone.